Ladies and gentlemen, welcome wrestling fans worldwide to Knoxville and the Great Smoky Mountains for the Ron Fuller, Tennessee Studcast.
6 feet 9 inches tall, 265 pounds.
This historic podcast from one of the most respected and successful wrestlers and promoters will follow the footsteps of the largest and oldest wrestling family on the planet.
Listen to what I'm saying. That's right. Bring that camera in here a little bit closer.
Through 93 years and 4 generations.
The stud has arrived.
Old school or new fan, this unique broadcast will educate and captivate as Ron details decades of professional wrestling's growth with truly unforgettable stories.
I want those people out there at home to hear the stud.
Sit back and enjoy the ride with the Tennessee Stud.
The Tennessee Stud. You will learn that name. You will remember it.
And now,
the stud is here.
All right, let's get it going. Hey, everybody, welcome in. It's David Summers, and it's another Studcast with the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. It's the story of wrestling in America as told by the Stud, whose family started the profession over 100 years ago. So now, let's step back into the ring, back into time. Let's get wall-to-wall, treetop tall with the Tennessee Stud, Ron Fuller. Hey, Ron, I got to tell you, lots of fans are making it known how much they're enjoying your new hidden history lessons that you're now doing in each Studcast. You're bringing to wrestling podcast subjects that have never been discussed before on any podcast that I'm aware of. Things that concerned everybody from wrestlers to owners to fans that very few wrestling podcasts expose.
Well, that's probably because very few people in the wrestling business and practically no fans had any idea how much was going on basically behind the scenes and what made wrestling, that's kind of what made wrestling a unique business. I benefited greatly from growing up in it, starting out with numerous discussions with my grandfather, who started in professional wrestling in 1924. And speaking of that, Dave, I think you just covered it, man. Since he started in 1924, now you can change your introduction a little bit. You just did. You must be ahead of me, man, because now we're actually more than 100 years in the sport. We're now at 101 years.
That's a great point, Stud. I did make that change. I kind of anticipated this was going to be happening. We had a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago. This is going to be your 4th hidden history lesson, by the way. I think you said this one is going to be about one of the worst mistakes made by wrestling owners to push for state boxing and wrestling commissions. Last Studcast, you talked about swapping out some talent, basically giving us a booker's lesson, which I really enjoyed. This time it sounds like we're going to be discussing an owner's lesson, maybe.
Yeah, that's correct. I think, we're going to be begin a deep dive, basically, into how, when, and where boxing and wrestling commissions started. And I'm sad to say my grandfather, Roy Welch, was responsible for many of them in the Deep South. And I first heard of boxing and wrestling commissions when I was about 12 years old. My grandfather used to take me with him on Monday afternoons when we'd go and visit. Sometimes we spent a great deal of time in the summer when we were out of school, Rob and I, with my grandfather and on his dairy. And on the Monday afternoons back in the 1950s, he lived in Yorkville, Tennessee. His dairy was there, and he would go on Monday nights to Memphis. It was about 100 miles south driving, but when for the trip with Roy, it was 100 miles, but we'd make it in about an hour because he was driving 100 miles an hour the whole trip, right? Wow. I mean, he was rolling all the time. So it only took about an hour to get there, and we'd go to the live wrestling event that night. So in a 100-mile trip, basically, he changed from a dairy farmer into a wrestling company owner.
All right. Is he responsible for you having the ability to be successful in other businesses later in life after finishing your wrestling career? Because it's obvious that you kind of branched out a little, like you did with hockey teams and even ADT security business.
I never thought about it that way, Dave. My father was pretty good at making money in other ways too, other than just wrestling. But that's a good question, and I'm sure it may have had some effect on me for sure.
All right, what about Robert and Jimmy Golden? Are they just pretty boys, or did they go too? Didn't Jimmy and his mother live with your grandfather for a while?
Yeah, sure did. Jimmy lived there with his mother. Once his mother and got divorced from her father, and so Roy would take me with him, but so he didn't much like to go with Rob and Jimmy. So maybe one of the first times he went, they went. One of the first times he ever took us, he took all three of us, and they were a little younger than I was, and they were a little harder to control than I was. And so every time we went, Roy, after that first time, Roy said, he never said it to me, but he let them know. He every time after that, Roy kind of got rid of Robert and Jimmy before we left. So my grandfather was a bit of a crazy guy, man. Unlike anything most people had ever seen, I can guarantee you that. And he took care of this task of getting Rob and Jimmy out of the car in a very unique way. So this was back when we were all kids, right? 10, 12 years old, and they both had BB guns. And when he could get his hands on one of those BB guns, he'd start shooting them with their own guns, right? And if it was inside the house, sometimes they'd get under the dining room table, as an example. They'd run and try to hide. And then, if they did, he'd just sit down on the floor and he'd just start popping them, man, shooting them. Pow, pow. And they would scream and scream. And then they couldn't take any more. They'd usually run out the door and they'd go to climb the nearest tree to the house most of the time. So Roy had hurt his hip in wrestling many years before, and he walked on a cane during this time frame. And he'd follow him to the tree, and they'd be perched up in the top of it, and then he'd sit down on the ground, and he'd go the routine again. He'd just start shooting them, leg, back, arm, until they couldn't take it anymore, and they'd finally jump out of the tree. And then they'd start running away from the house and back toward the pasture, because he had a big dairy farm back to where the cows were staying most of the time. So then we'd go to his Cadillac, and he'd go there, and the first thing he'd do is get in the glove compartment, and he'd get something with a little more power. He always had a pistol in his glove compartment, and most times he had the gun filled with blanks. So he'd pull that gun out and he'd start firing at them until they were almost out of sight. And then he would say to me, okay, get in the car now. We can go.
So were the boys a little skittish growing up?
Well, you can only imagine.
It's like all of a sudden they think they've been hit by, I don't know, maybe a yellow jacket or something. All right, you're not making this stuff up, right? So he actually fired a pistol at his grandsons, Robert and Jimmy.
Yeah, he certainly did, man.
Okay.
And, and it had, most of the time it had blanks in it. Sometimes it would have a live shell in it, but he knew it was, and he didn't shoot very close to him then. But, and he'd do that to wrestlers, too. I mean, it wasn't just Rob and Jimmy. He had that pistol, and he'd take it out at any time. You never know when he was going to shoot you with it. So it was on these Monday night trips to Memphis, man, where I really learned so much about the wrestling business as a young boy. So I was on one of those trips with my grandfather that he told me the story of how he started and built his territory, and the mistake that he made later, creating the first boxing and wrestling commissions, by trying to protect his business from the competition in all the cities that he was going to be running across the southern United States. He needed some way to control who was going to be in it and trying to get in it.
Wow. All right, you already have my attention, Stud, but before you tell us about boxing and wrestling commissions, tell us how he built his wrestling company.
Well, man, that's a very interesting story. And the answer to that question, Dave, I guess, is why he needed these state-run athletic commissions, because of the way he built this wrestling empire. And I already said he's a little bit crazy, but an old wrestling shooter, and gosh, he had the ultimate respect for the wrestling business, and along with that, he had absolutely no fear of any man. I mean, he was a bad dude. And in 1924, he started wrestling in one of the first ever wrestling territories in the country, in Columbus, Ohio. And then by 1930, after 6 years of wrestling there, he took his skills and his respect for the business and what he had learned about running a territory in those 6 years, and left and went into the state of Tennessee to start his own companies. And he started to run some towns with wrestlers. He took some guys from the Ohio territory, became his friends during that 6 years, and some of them went with him to Tennessee and became wrestlers in his first territory. So there was no organized professional wrestling in that part of the country back in 1936, as you could imagine. 1930, man, early in the 30s, and there was only a few random places that had occasionally had matches, with usually only 4 wrestlers on a card. And he wanted fans to see only the best. And since he'd been trained by one of the greatest shooters of all time, the original Dutch Mantel, he shut down all wrestling that he considered that wasn't going to be as good as his own wrestling. So and the way he shut it down is he'd find one of these wrestling matches, see it advertised, hear about it, and he would go to the building. And he'd just shove his way in. He didn't even buy a ticket. I asked him, you didn't buy a ticket? No. So why would I buy a ticket? And he said he would first then watch the matches to see if any of the guys that were wrestling knew anything about wrestling, and if they were any good at all. And then as soon as the event was over, he'd go to the dressing room before those guys left the dressing room. And he didn't open the door. He said, I'd kick the door open to the dressing room. And I asked him, why would you do that? And he said, I wanted to, set the tone.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what I want to set the tone here. So, and then he said, since the cards only had 4 wrestlers on it, there were 2 guys in each of the 2 dressing rooms, and they usually had separate dressing rooms. And he said, first thing I would do is introduce myself, tell them who I was. And then he said, then I would tell them that you guys are no longer wrestlers, unless, of course, you want to wrestle for me. And then if he said, you don't like that idea, about not wrestling for me, and thinking you're still going to wrestle, he says, we'll just take care of that problem right now. So then he told him, he said, if I catch any of you boys wrestling again, he goes, there's going to be a price to be paid, man. And so he said, now you can pack your bags. And he said, and you can consider your wrestling career's over forever. And then he'd visit the other dressing room, and give them the same story. And then after running the wrestlers off, he would find the guy that ran the show. And he would tell that guy, he said, I would tell him that, hey, this is your last wrestling show. And he says, if I ever hear you running a wrestling show again, he goes, you're not going to like what's going to happen to you, man.
Oh. Wow. All right. So did he ever have anyone that wasn't happy to hear that and really like, okay, I want a piece of you. Come on.
That's what I asked him, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
But early on in these Memphis trips, he had asked me a question. One of the first trips we made that was really good. He said, that this is kind of an answer to that question. He said, he asked me if I knew what to do. He said, if you're fighting somebody, boy, and he goes, and you can't beat him, and you see that he's going to beat you. And he said, do you know what to do? And I said, no, what would you do? He said, if I couldn't beat him, he said, I'd eat him.
What?
He said, if I couldn't beat him, I'd eat him.
Eat him.
He said, and I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I'd get one finger in my mouth and I'd eat that finger off, and then I'd eat that hand off, and then the arm off, and then until I'd eat him until he was all gone. So many of those old shooters that came with him to Tennessee in 1930, they were still working for him during this time frame. Now it's in the 1950s, and 20 years later, right? And some of them worked in his office in Nashville. And so in Memphis, I'd ask those guys, then they were usually around handling back doors or handling jobs for Roy, I'd ask them, because I wanted to know after getting that story, I said, well, how mean a guy was Roy? And every one of them said he was the toughest human they'd ever seen.
Wow.
So hopefully that answers your question about why he's asking me, what are you going to do? So,
yeah, I think it definitely answered my question. All right, so is that how he built a 10-state territory?
Well, that was only the beginning. I mean, he didn't have to do that.
Right.
But that's all the way he knew how to handle things. He was a little heavy-handed, I guess you would call it. And so word got out quick about him. It didn't take long for anybody who was thinking about running a wrestling deal to find out that, hey, this guy named Roy Welch is going to show up, and you better not do this. So these tough wrestlers, if there was a tough wrestler and a good wrestler in that part of the country, they made a point of finding him then, and they would ask him, can I go to work for you? Because after he had done this a while, he had no competition. There wasn't anybody running wrestling in the state of Tennessee but Roy, and that's kind of where the state boxing and wrestling commissions come in.
Wow. So kind of amazing yet frightening information, Ron. Thanks for that. A lot. All right. So now we know about how he got the business started. So why, when, where, and maybe how did he start to establish boxing and wrestling commissions?
Well, let's start this, man, with your first question about why. Why did he want to have a boxing and wrestling commission? So he told me early on, and I asked him about it. I said, he said he realized he couldn't continue to control the entire state, and much less expand into the other states he wanted to in the South, using those strong arm tactics. He said he was very honest. He said, if I did it that way, he said, I might end up in jail. Right? So he wanted to maintain control of the entire state and be the only promoter of wrestling in the state. So he came up with a legal way to do it. And at the same time, it was a way to make himself more powerful than just a wrestling promoter. So that idea was by, getting himself involved in politics. And as far as when and where, I'll try to get to those for you. Roy arrived in Tennessee, like I said, in 1930. By 1935, he pretty much controlled all wrestling in Tennessee. In 1935, he came up with this idea to get the state of Tennessee involved rather than his company and let the state police his territory. In that same year, he went to the governor of Tennessee, a guy named Hill McAllister, and he proposed a plan for boxing and wrestling commissions. His plan for the state was to create his boxing and wrestling commission to oversee both the sports. And, he explained to the governor of that state, the state would receive a small portion of the proceeds from each event. All the boxers, the wrestlers, the referees, and the promoters would all have to buy a license to operate an event or compete in one in the state of Tennessee. So then Roy recommended, which was really smart, the commissions be controlled by 3 members, all of which were going to be represented by one of the 3, the Veterans of Foreign Affairs, the Veterans of Foreign Wars Organization, the American Legion, the Disabled Veterans of America. He got the veterans involved, and they're going to get some support as well.
Wow, that is a cool deal. Your grandfather, really quite the man. He was dealing directly with a governor and recommending the 3 controlling members of the commission that he proposed be associated with foreign war organizations.
Sounds like he had a big heart, but it wasn't all a big heart, Dave. In return, in the beginning of these commissions, he was going to receive the state's protection of his company's monopoly, basically, and when it came to who could run wrestling in the state of Tennessee. So it was a benefit him big time as well. So as time went on, man, he expanded his wrestling company into other states, other southern states. And this first boxing and wrestling commission that he set up in Tennessee, that was the template for all those other states as time went on there, as he expanded his territory. As the expansion of the territory grew, he became more political, especially when it came to donations, right? And especially in gubernatorial elections. He liked to deal with the governors, right? So many times he backed both candidates just in case. Hey, if this guy loses, I want to make sure I get the other guy involved too, and he may not know I'm giving to both. So things were going to change. All this started to change in about the 1950s in a bad way for everybody working in the business as time went by. Wrestling companies lost their clout. And his influence. He lost a little of his pull because obviously the governors were changing. They were being reelected, and he was going through this process, and he knew them less well than he knew the first guys, and so it was going to be a big change that was going to come later on. Athletic commissions basically were going to end up ruling the day. So continuing to raise the percentage, they started to raise the percentage that the gate that they got. They were receiving from the events, and the wrestlers' licenses went up, and the promoters' licenses went up, and so in the next Studcast, we're going to pick this story up about in the 1960s. By that time, promoters all over the country were looking for ways to behead these commission monsters, man. That's what basically he had done, is created a monster here. And not only him, but that was picked up by a whole lot of other promoters around the country. And now most of the country had boxing and wrestling commissions.
I absolutely love these hidden history lessons. And I think I also remember back in early Studcast where you were talking about your grandfather, he was friends with a lot of governors, and he ended up with a lot of badges that he could keep in the car. And if he was ever pulled over, you told a lot of stories about that in the past. Yeah,
that's for sure. So that's exactly what he did. I mean, he had relationships with governors in every state, and they all gave him badges. He was because he gave him a pretty substantial contribution, I'd say, to getting reelected, and so he got the clout from that, and. So he was a very rare dude, man.
Yeah, which is why he could kind of tool down the highway at about 100 miles an hour, and nobody really bothered him. Listen, I'm sure I'm not the only one to be totally unaware of these state athletic commissions. I can't wait to hear how the territories dealt with them. That's going to be interesting, too. And before we go to the break, can you give us the card? Let's check out the card for Mobile, Alabama. I think the date is going to be Tuesday, January 22nd, 1980.
I sure can, my man. It was a triple main event card. 2 of those main events were not going to be announced until the TV show, which was just days before the events. And nobody would know what that card was until the television show happened, the actual card. So the opening match was Terry Orndorff versus Ted Oates. Eddie Boulder was wrestling against the unmasked at this point, Super Pro, Randy Rose. He no longer had his mask because he had lost it, and the wrestling pro had beat him in the mask versus mask match. Then the wrestling pro, Leon Baxter, was going to be facing another guy, a new guy, great wrestler, man, Big Bill Dromo. And then for the Southeastern tag belts, the new champions, Rob and I, we had just won them the week before. We're going to announce who we were going to defend against on the upcoming TV show. And in a United States Junior Heavyweight Championship match, there's going to be a loser. Loser of the match is going to leave Southeastern. You had the champion, the great Mephisto, defending against the former champion, Tony Charles. And then the last match was for the Southeastern Championship. There was a no disqualification match that had to have a winner. Basically, somebody had to win this. The likelihood of the belt changing hands pretty good in those situations. Joe LeDuc was facing the champion Mongolian Stomper, managed by the great Mephisto.
A really, really good card right there. It had a new arrival who was a respected name in Southern wrestling, Big Bill Dromo, making his debut, plus 3 title matches, one of which was a loser leaves Southeastern match. So a lot of questions on that card. And when we come back after the break, we're going to dive in a little deeper into the TV show that promoted it and set the whole thing up. That is coming up when this Studcast continues in a moment. Ask the Stud 13, the question and answer show, exclusively on YouTube Southeastern Rewind. You know what, folks? It may have been a day or two late due to the weather in Tennessee, but it's well worth the wait. The 13th in the series is full of great questions, and when that happens, it sets the Stud up for fantastic answers. Nobody does question and answer shows better than Ron. Having come from the oldest and largest wrestling family on the planet gives him the leverage of a great wrist lock on history. All 13 of these Ask the Stud shows are classics. If you've never checked them out, this one is a great place to start. Ask the Stud 13 on YouTube Southeastern Rewind. All right, Studcast fans, welcome back in the second half of this Studcast, which so far really good as we get it going, and we're going to get deeper in this second half. This one is number 334. It's called LeDuc and Stomper at it again, and I'm pretty sure that's what we're about to approach. So, how did the TV show 3 days before the Mobile card you talked about before the break on Saturday, January 19th, 1980, how did that TV show open up?
Well, it opened up with Rob and I, and we were the newly won Southeastern Tag champions. We had the belts at the set with us. We were the Charlie Platt. And he congratulated us, and we got a standing ovation from the studio audience. And then Charlie showed the video of how we became champions 5 days earlier in Mobile, Alabama, winning the loser. We had a loser of the fall, had to leave Southeastern match with the Mongolians, who were the champions on that card the week before. And the younger Mongolian, the Stomper's son, lost the match. And he had already at this point left the Gulf Coast. He left almost immediately after that match. So Charlie asked, who was going to be our choice to defend our belts against for the first time. So we told him, we kind of both giggled and laughed a little bit and said, I thought you might have figured that out, Charlie. We told him, we want to wrestle the 2 guys that injured our dad 3 weeks earlier in the 2-ring battle royal. Same 2 guys that we beat 2 weeks ago for the Mobile $10,000 battle royal money. The cowards from Tennessee, I think that's what we called them. And so Charlie said, he says, now I know exactly who you're talking about. And he said, so since you're already here with me at the city, I'd like to invite both of you to stay with me, because those 2 guys are in the upcoming TV match. So the bell was rung, and then the studio exploded in boos. I mean, these 2 guys had some real heat, man. And Jimmy Golden and Norvell Austin, man, they popped out of the Hills dressing room. And Jimmy and Norvell, they wasted no time on their opponents, man. They beat both of them, and they used what was becoming their favorite finish move, the pile driver. The same move they hurt our dad with 3 weeks earlier on New Year's Day in 1980.
Yeah, wow. All right, so a huge amount of animosity between the 4 of you. I bet you guys had some great matches with each other. So how about the second TV match? Let's move to that one.
Okay, the second segment began with the wrestling pro at the set with Charlie. And he told Charlie he was there to put an end to this, at this point, pretty long-running feud between him and he called him the punk named Randy Rose, which was, I'm sure Rose had to hate that. And, and that he'd been calling he says that's the punk that's been calling himself the Super Pro. And he said, the guy I finally unmasked, Charlie. So this guy, everybody knows who he is now. So they watched the end of what the Pro referred to as a misunderstanding between him and the young punk that he'd kind of put behind him now, and he was going to move on to bigger and better competition. And he pointed out, he says, look, my next match here is with a guy named Big Bill Dromo, who's a big star in the South, and so, he said something about, he said, Big Bill Dromo is a highly respected wrestler, unlike Randy Rose, who hadn't made a name for himself and never will, right? I mean, Randy, he was getting a little upset with this kind of interview. So the video kind of showed the Pro, putting the Super Pro, that was Randy before he was unmasked to sleep again, as he had done with him several times in several matches. And then he pulled his mask off before he woke him up. Right? He didn't take a chance that he might not get his mask off if he woke him up. So he beat him with a sleeper hold. He pulled the mask off of him, and then he woke him up. And then the Pro, kind of set him up against his knee and let everybody in the building see his face. And, then the announcer announced that, ladies and gentlemen, the Super Pro is Randy Rose, right? So the video continued because after the Pro left the ring, as soon as he took his mask off and he let everybody see his face, he left the ring. And so Randy Rose, he got up and he grabbed the microphone, the building microphone in Mobile, and he promised that, hey, this ain't over yet between me and you, man, talking to the wrestling Pro. And so Charlie asked the Pro, he says, hey, would you like to stay and see the next match? He goes, it's with the unmasked Randy Rose, the guy that you unmasked, right? And the Pro told Charlie, he said, no. He said, I'm finished with that guy. So he really, really dug him big time, man, during that second segment, Bill, leading up to the match.
So I think you just answered my next question, Ron, about who was in the next match. So I can't believe Randy Rose thought he could ever unmask the Pro.
Well, obviously it didn't work for him. So, but Randy at this point was really mad. I mean, he'd listened to that interview and, watching on the screen in the back. And, he had to be upset. The Pro just blew him off, man, like he was nobody, making fun of him, basically. So when Rose went to the ring, man, he was mad. And so his opponent in that match, he paid the price for the Pro upsetting Randy Rose. And wow, Rose left his opponent. He left him unconscious, man. He hit him with one of those clotheslines, a really stiff one coming off the ropes. And then when the guy's laying there and he'd pinned him, he got up, Rose, and he screamed at Charlie over there at the set by himself because the Pro didn't want to be there. And he said, you could tell that old mask man, he said, the next one of these clotheslines is going to be for him.
Okay, so who was in the personality profile?
Well, it was with the extremely popular, at this point, Joe LeDuc, man. And you could tell how strong he was over when he came out of the dressing room and he went to the set with Charlie. I mean, the studio crowd, they just came alive, man. It's like they loved him. They were just really into him at this point. And Joe looked like, man, he'd been in a car wreck, man. He had one black eye, and his forehead was covered with homemade butterfly stitches, which he liked to do because he got such bad cuts on his head, he had to go to the hospital and get them sewed up. So he started making his own stitches, butterfly stitches, and it saved him going to the hospital. And it lasted pretty good for him. They would stay in there for a little bit, So, and it saved him from having to get real stitches put into his head every time him and the Stomper had these matches in the ring. They were just bloodbath. They were just cutting each other. It was horrible.
Wow.
So seeing him like that, it reminded me. It took me back to 1977 when that first war between Joe and the Stomper was going on, the one that started in Tennessee with the blockbusting incident and all that stuff. So Joe was a really smart babyface, man. He was always so humble and respectful to everybody, but especially the fans. That's why they loved him so much. He spent all of his time when he went into buildings, leaving the dressing room and out there patting the fans on the back and, just going through the buildings and shaking hands. He was just, it was because, he realized that, he wasn't a very pretty guy. And actually, he was a very scary looking dude, man, to be a baby face. So he began this profile with kind of a proof of what I just said, He started off by apologizing to Charlie for losing his cool last week. And they had that big fight with the Mongolian Stomper that went all over the studio. And he made a point specifically of mentioning, I really was sorry, Charlie, I want to apologize for slamming the Stomper's face into your desk, in the front of your set there. And he's also, Charlie, he said, I hope nothing like that's going to ever happen again. So Charlie said after seeing the blockbusting here on the TV 2 weeks earlier, he said he understood why Joe was so angry with the Stomper. Made a lot of sense the way that happened and all that blockbusting went down. And he told Joe he hoped he didn't mind, but he wanted to show some of what happened on the end of last week's TV show for the fans that might have missed last week's TV show, since Joe had already apologized for it. So then Charlie called for the director to run a short piece of the video, and it showed how violent and quickly, man, these incidents between these two guys could occur, and it got totally out of control. And as soon as the video was over, Joe apologized again for what had happened. So then the discussions changed entirely. And it got on to Joe's second chance. In this upcoming week, he's going to get his second chance at the Southeastern Championship for the Mongolian Stomper. And it's going to be in a special no disqualification match for the belt. And Joe thanked Southeastern Commissioner Don Curtis, especially after what had happened last week on TV, for allowing him a second chance at a title. He almost, he said, I'm happy I got the first chance, but after what happened last week, he's going to give me a second chance. Can't hardly believe it, but he said, I'm going to make this match count, man. I'm going to win this championship belt. So he admitted he was not the most skillful wrestler. And because of what had happened between him and the Mongolian Stomper years ago, they were never going to have a clean. So I'm not going to ever have a clean wrestling match against a Mongolian Stomper, and fans must know that. They come, they see it, and he thanked the fans for their continued support and said he hoped to be back next week with the Southeastern belt on. And he left the set with a wow, which was a tremendous roar of applause. He was over.
Oh, good deal. Another great personality profile. So how about the next match? Who was set for that one?
Well, the subject of the personality profile was on the next one, and that was a Mongolian Stomper. And wow, did he make an entrance. I mean, when it came time for the profile to be over, he barely got Joe out of the way, and Charlie changed sets, and just immediately by the time Charlie had gotten on the set, here came the Stomper, and he didn't come opening the door and coming out of the. He busted out of the dressing room, and he headed for where, man, the studio audience. And wow, here it was, man, total pandemonium, man, as usual. They weren't expecting him, right? So it was even worse, and that made it even more chaotic. And so then the great Mephisto, he came, and rather than going after the Stomper, he just went straight into the ring carrying the Stomper's belt. And he stood there smiling, and as his animal out there wreaked havoc in the studio, man. And then the Stomper, he didn't look any better than Joe LeDuc in the personality profile. I mean, those two guys had these savage matches, and I hadn't seen anything like it since Tennessee. And the ones that were in the Gulf Coast, I think maybe we're just as bad or worse. So the Stomper's head was just as bad as Joe LeDuc's was, you know. And he also had this big bruise on the right side of his chest. It looked like somebody hit him with a sledgehammer, man. It was a big old monster bruise. So they were just killing each other. So it certainly didn't slow him down, though. I mean, he showed no mercy on his opponent, I can tell you that. Another one that had to be carried from the ring when it was over.
God. Okay, so it sounds like another wild TV. How about the last TV match?
Well, it started with the new United States Junior Heavyweight Champion, Tony Charles. He was at the set with Charlie. And Tony was extremely upset that he had won the belt back from the great Mephisto 5 days earlier in Mobile. But he didn't, he still didn't have his belt. And Charlie asked the director to run the video to show the fans what had happened and why he didn't have his belt. So it clearly showed that Tony Charles beat the great Mephisto in the middle of the ring. And the Expo Hall crowd in Mobile there, which was probably over 5,000 as normal, they were just, they exploded, man, with the fact that Tony had beat the Mephisto. Tony was so excited in the video after he won the belt that he wanted to put the belt on before he left the ring. So he was struggling to get the belt on because when you put those things behind you and they had snaps on them, you couldn't hardly snap the snaps without some help. So the referee saw that he was trying to put the belt on and he went over to help him. And, and that was a big mistake because Mephisto was still in the ring. So when the referee and Tony on the far side of the ring, they had their back turned to Mephisto and they're trying to put the belt on. Mephisto ran across the ring and he hit the referee in the back with a huge knee, and that drove the referee headfirst into Tony, and both of them went down. Mephisto then put Tony in his camel clutch hold, man, and he put his hands around Tony's throat for leverage, and he choked him out. And then as soon as Tony went out, he grabbed the belt and he took the belt to the dressing room. So Tony asked him, to stop the video. He had seen all he could of it, and he said he had spoken to Don Curtis, Southeastern commissioner, days early. And he said, I asked Don Curtis if I could have a loser leave Southeastern match with Mephisto, and the winner is going to win the belt and keep the belt, and I want to settle this once and for all. And he said, but I want to get my belt back, and he said, I haven't heard anything from Don Curtis about my request. Has he talked to you, Charlie? And so he was very concerned about the belt.
Wow. All right. So Mephisto had not returned the United States Junior Heavyweight belt 5 days later. So, but did you think he was going to be able to keep it?
I don't.
Did he think
I don't really know the answer to that one, Dave.
Right.
Remember, he was already set to leave the territory and go to work somewhere else. When I talked to him a couple of weeks earlier, and we worked out a date for him to leave Southeastern, and it certainly wouldn't have been the first time a wrestler stole a belt from a wrestling company and left the territory. So Charlie had Tony's answer from Don Curtis, and he told Tony, he says, you are going to get that loser leave match with Mephisto that you asked for. And he told Tony, you'll be getting the match. And he says, as a matter of fact, Mephisto's in the next TV match. So Tony had the United States, the junior heavyweight champion. He had been on and off. He had owned that belt for more than 3 years. And I guess, that was long enough for Tony to feel kind of like this belt is mine. It really belonged to him. And you got the feeling that way when you were a champion and you wore that same belt for a long time. It meant a lot to you. So Mephisto's opponent was already in the ring, and when Mephisto came out of the dressing room, Tony's sitting there with Charlie, and Mephisto's wearing the United States Junior Heavyweight belt. And he got in the ring with it, and that was it. Tony Charles went nuts. He just charged the ring, and he started literally beating the hell out of Mephisto. I mean, it's like, wow, this is a shoot. And Mephisto, his opponent for the TV match, he instantly realized, well, this ain't a good place for me to be, and so did the TV announcer. both of those guys left the ring. They ran, and then Tony was a great shooter from England. He was a bad son of a gun. He knew how to hurt you, man. And Mephisto wanted no part of Tony, really, that's for sure. And so the Mongolian Stomper, because Mephisto's his manager at this point, he hit the ring and he tried to pull Tony off of Mephisto. And everybody in the studio by this point's on their feet. And, as soon as Tony got the belt, Joe LeDuc was watching me in the dressing room with, we're back in the dressing room, we're watching on the monitor what's going on, and so Tony, as soon as he got the belt off of Mephisto and he felt like he had kicked his butt enough, he left the ring. So now you got the Mongolian Stomper in there working, starting to go for Tony, and so it's getting kind of wild there. So so Mephisto, he ran to the dressing room like a scalded dog. Well, Tony's down, and Stomper's kicking him pretty good and stomping him pretty good, and Joe LeDuc's back in the dressing room with me and the other baby faces, and he sees what's going on, and he don't ask anything. He just bolts right straight out of the dressing room, and he goes right straight for the Stomper. So now you got I looked at the rest of the guys and I go, oh no, we can't have another one of these like we had last week, right? So I said, we got to go get him, guys. And so we went after LeDuc, and then the other dressing room guys came to the ring because they saw what was going on and they were trying to get the Stomper. And so, wow, we ended up with this time the fight might have been even wilder than the week before, where Joe was already apologizing.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like Tony Charles really took that personally about the belt. I mean, he was pretty ticked off, was he?
Yeah. I soon found out after this was all over that, and he came and apologized to me, and he told me, he said, I just want you to know, I lost my temper. I'm sorry, Ron, and I almost started a battle royal out there. He goes, and so later I spoke with Mephisto about it, and he was happy to hear that Tony was kind of okay about it because he was going to be wrestling him again the next week, and he was like, "Oh boy, I don't want to have him mad, man." And they were going to be in a loser lead town match.
So a really crazy TV show this one was. So what happened in Mobile? Let's go to Tuesday, January 22nd, 1980.
Well, Terry Orndorff, younger brother, a Hall of Famer, man, Paul Orndorff, won his match with Ted Oates. Randy Rose, the former Super Pro, won his match over Eddie Boulder. The wrestling pro, Leon Baxter, beat Big Bill Dromo. And in the Southeastern Tag Championship match, Rob and I lost by disqualification to Jimmy Golden and Norvell Austin. And we got disqualified because they, right at in the match, probably 15 minutes into the match, they end up throwing Rob over the top rope on the concrete twice without the referee seeing it either time. So, and then Rob finally was able to get back into the ring, and he finally got to me, and wow, I was mad about, he's already taken 2 bumps on the concrete and we haven't got our hand raised. And so I instantly went in the ring and I grabbed Golden and I threw him over the top rope. Then I went and grabbed Norvell and threw him over the top rope. And so the referee, what's he going to do? He didn't see them do it to Rob, but he just saw me do it to them, and he disqualified me and Rob. And their hands got raised, but they couldn't win the belts because it was a no disqualification match. Then in the United States Junior Heavyweight Championship match between the champion, at this point, Tony Charles, the champion, he's got his belt back, and the former champion, Great Mephisto. Tony Charles retained his belt, and Great Mephisto was out of the territory. But in the last match, now Mephisto's still the manager of the Mongolian Stomper. He's lost this match, but in the last match, he went to the ring for the Southeastern Heavyweight Championship match between the champion Stomper against Joe LeDuc. And it was going to be the second time that Joe LeDuc had an opportunity to win the title. And this time, Joe LeDuc ready to give his all, man, to become the Southeastern Gulf Coast champion. He had told everybody he was going to do that.
Yeah.
Promised them in the profile, I'm going to be wearing the belt. So he was in total control of this match. And the building was on its feet, man. And Joe grabbed his bear hug on the Mongol. And when he did, instead of just putting the bear hug on him, he drove him back into the ring corner. But the referee was standing in that ring corner, and he got squashed by that. Joe just pulverized it, drove the Mongolian Stomper on top of him, and his referee went down. His referee was hurt. Mephisto, at that point, came in the ring. And for the first time since he'd been in Southeastern, I knew that he was capable of doing this. He threw a fireball, man. He waved one of those deals. He lit the fire. He threw it, and he threw it at the back of Joe's head. Joe still had Stomper in the bear hug, and then Joe must have had it. You could see this fire coming from the corner of his eye because he ducked the fire, and the Stomper saw it coming because he was looking straight at Mephisto, and he tried to duck too. But he couldn't get ducked totally because he was still in the bear hug. And some of those flames dropped on the Stomper's back. So Joe nailed Mephisto, knocked him out of the ring. Stomper was rolling on the mat, trying to get his back out, the fire put out on his back. And the referee, he didn't see the fireball. He had not seen any of this. He did. But, referee got up. LeDuc covered Stomper. And the referee counted the champion out, which meant Joe LeDuc won that match. Building exploded Expo Hall, man.
Wow.
Those fans there were crazy anyway. And Joe hand was raised, and the belt was presented to him. And when he left the ring, the crowd at ringside, they came to the ring and took him off the ring and put him on their shoulders and carried Joe LeDuc to the dressing room on their shoulders.
Man, those were the days in wrestling. That doesn't happen today in wrestling. That's 100% for sure, but that's amazing that the crowd could hover to the ring and then pick the wrestler up and take him back to the dressing room. That is amazing. And a great way to finish an incredible night of wrestling, Stud.
Well, it wasn't over yet, Dave.
Oh.
I mean, as the crowd carried LeDuc back to the dressing room, the great Mephisto had crawled back into the ring. And then there he stood face to face with the Mongolian Stomper, who he had at this point burned, and he caused him to get beat, right? Caused him to lose his Southeastern belt. So then came the biggest pop of the night. The Mongolian Stomper tore into the great Mephisto. And you couldn't hear yourself think in that building, man. And, so they finally, he did everything he could think of to Mephisto. And the fans loved every bit of it. Wow, they were so into it. And then on the end, he had him on his back, and he ran to the ropes, and he stomped him right in the face. And,
Whoa.
And he left him laying out. He knocked him cold. And Stomper left the ring and went to the dressing room. Some of the fans were cheering for the Stomper, but everybody crowded up around the ring, and there's Mephisto laying there out cold.
Wow, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that happen before. Mephisto, in his last night in Southeastern, lost a loser leaves match. He threw fire. He burned his own champion and was left laying in the ring by his own man.
Yeah.
What a finish.
Oh, boy, I'm a Southeastern fan. We're never going to see the great Mephisto again. That was the last time they ever saw the great Mephisto. And you're right, Dave. There's not much worse way to go out than that.
Yeah. Yeah, these folks really love you. Bye-bye. All right. What a tremendous Studcast this has been. So what was the attendance? Lay it out for us in these three major cities.
Well, business obviously was on fire. I mean, two of the three buildings were almost full, and the third in Mobile, as usual, it not only sold out, but it turned fans away again. This was 3 weeks in a row now that these buildings had been practically all full. Mm-hmm. And all three of these Alabama cities averaged about 5,000 fans each for the third week in a row, too.
Wow. That is awesome. That is so much fun. All right, listen, I'm sorry, but it looks like we're not going to have enough time for a learning tree question. And, Ron, I have to ask a couple of questions, though. With the attendance numbers you were drawing, Southeastern Gulf Coast had to be one of the best territories out there during this time. So how are you going to replace the young Mongol from last week and the great Mephisto from this Studcast and keep drawing big crowds like you were? And one last question, where are we riding next week? Let's see you answer all that.
All right, so let me see if I can piece this together for you.
All right.
Okay, so our attendance numbers, let's start with the attendance. In the Southeastern Gulf Coast territories, you had the three major cities, obviously, and all three of them were very strong at this point in drawing, and especially when you consider the crowds and the biggest market. And I was looking back in 1980 at one of the populations of these three cities in Alabama that were in this Gulf Coast territory. Mobile in 1980 had just under 300,000 population. Montgomery had less than 100,000, and Dothan had less than 50,000 people living there. And that Dothan was running on a weekly basis, and up there drawing around 5,000 people per show. Dothan, Alabama had to undoubtedly be the best drawing wrestling city per population in the world. No doubt about it at this point, right? And as a comparison with Knoxville's 1980 population was 175,000. It was almost exactly as same as the population of Montgomery. Mm-hmm. And at this same time in 1980, the new owners there in Knoxville were drawing less than half of what Montgomery was bringing in every week.
Wow.
So as far, as how we're going to replace the Stomper's son and the great Mephisto and keep drawing crowds, which is a good question. How are we going to do that? So I'm going to start phase one of that answer next week. It's going to be in next week's show. We're going to get things started with somebody else. And we're going to be riding, man, with a new player next week, basically. It's kind of like a football team. We're going to add a star, man. The kind of player that's going to hold up the houses, man. And when he arrives, he's going to even add to them. It could be even better, man. And we're also going to be returning to the State Boxing and Wrestling Commission's national story. I've been telling now for a couple of weeks, and this is going to be this is the second part. We'll be talking about the second part of it here. Roy began to, at this point, see the mistake he had made as these state-run boxing and wrestling commissions began to take more control in the 1950s and 1960s especially. And these commission stories, man, I think fans are going to really love them. There's going to be a few more of them. We're going to end up talking about how Vince McMahon dealt with his situation with boxing and wrestling commissions that changed wrestling entirely.
Wow.
So there's a lot more history coming with the boxing and wrestling commission stuff. And then hopefully, Dave, we'll have enough for another learning tree question next week.
Oh, cool deal. I tell you what, this has been an extremely interesting Studcast again this week. I'm fascinated by your grandfather, all the things that he was into, and his maybe having made a mistake, creating his own monster with the boxing and wrestling commissions in many states. So I can't wait to hear who is going to take the place of two heel stars and keep the attendance ball rolling, as you said, and hopefully we can have a learning tree question to plug in next week. All right, folks, you know the deal. You find Ron on Facebook. He's there all the time. Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. Like and follow him there. Automatically become friends with a living legend. Exact same thing on Twitter or X. Find him at Ron Fuller Welch and follow him there too. And everything he posts on Facebook is also posted on Twitter. That's right, isn't it, Ron? You post everything on both?
Yes, certainly do.
Good deal. So if you're on one, you get the information, but why not be on both? Check out the fantastic website, tnstud.com. You want to talk about loaded down? Yeah, tnstud.com. This Studcast is going to be there with every Studcast ever done. Shop the Stud Store, where you get 43 Super Studcasts, 4 different 8x10 photos, the thrilling Lion novel, Brutus, personally autographed to you, and T-shirts still on sale, only $15.99, and boom, free shipping, just like that. Subscribe now at YouTube Southeastern Rewind. Get the best in old school wrestling. Go to YouTube. In the search bar, put in Southeastern Rewind. It's the first one that pops up. Find 386 videos and counting. The last 111 Studcast, 52 Stud stories, 95 short rides with the Stud, and now, maybe you've already seen it, and if you hadn't, it's a great place to start. 13 great Ask the Stud question and answer shows. Number 13 is now there, all exclusively on YouTube Southeastern Rewind. It is the best deal in old school wrestling. All right, any final words, Ron?
Well, as always, I want to thank all those that waited patiently last week. I apologize, man. We had some big ice storms and snow and everything up here in my part of the country, and we had to hold off on being able to record the Ask the Stud number 13. And I finally got it recorded, and now, as you mentioned, it's up on the YouTube Southeastern Rewind channel. And I just want to thank everybody for being patient with me, and thanks for the great comments that I receive every day from all the fans on all the social media sites that I have. And please take care of yourselves and others, and may God bless us all.
For Ron Fuller in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, I'm David Summers saying thank you for listening. Find me at davidsummersproductions@gmail.com. This Studcast is a David Summers production for Tennessee Stud, LLC.
Thanks for joining us today for this historic Studcast. The true story continues next week. So full Nelson your friends and point them in our direction for another ride with the Tennessee Stud.
1, 2, 3.
This is David Summers saying so long from the Great Smoky Mountains.